Hi, and welcome to the Value of Testing podcast. My name is Randy Rice, and today our podcast is all about have we forgotten what quality means? I want to tell you something that I've recently been doing. Over the years, over a lot of years, I'll just say, I have accumulated a massive amount of material. And at one point, I actually had all my old conference notebooks, which is saying something, because I went to my first software testing conference in 1989. But I finally realized I couldn't keep all this stuff. And I didn't want it to be a burden to my kids when one of these days I depart this earth and someone has to clean all this stuff up. So anyway, I've been scanning in the notebooks because I don't know, I kind of just like to keep the history of software testing, and things don't stay around forever on the internet. Those conference proceedings are no longer there. I may be, who knows, the last person to have any of it. So anyway, I was making yet another trip into the attic, pulling out the boxes. This coming Saturday is conveniently a shred day at one of the local credit unions around here, so wanted to get all that stuff together, and I came across this little gem. This is from 1991. This is from QAI's 1991 International Conference on Software Testing. It weighs in at over 400 double-sided pages. And in fact, I think it was probably the second year that I spoke at a testing conference. And so I was very excited to do that. I'd just been out on my own as a consultant starting in June of 1990. So this was the new world in front of me. Also something I've been doing this week. I've made a list of all the presentations I've made in my career. And it took 7 pages to contain all of them. It's a complete chronology from 1990, I guess, all the way up to present day. Now, it kind of tells an interesting story because I really quit doing conferences around the pandemic. Everyone did, right? So I kind of went more toward webinars and those kind of things. So it's been a little while since I've spoken at a testing conference. And honestly, I can't say that I've missed it much. I do miss being around people, but as I looked at each one of those events, some were like in Hong Kong and Tel Aviv and, very far away from here, but each event basically represented another trip in a plane, another week in a hotel someplace, another week away from my family. And on one hand, it was inspiring. On the other hand, it was kind of depressing, when you look at it that way. But anyway, I digress. One of the presentations and papers in that notebook I just showed you was from Dr. Boris Beiser. Some of you might recall that name. He is one of the fathers of our software testing profession. The name of the paper is Honey, I Shrank the Risk, or Did I? And it's really an interesting paper. I'm working to try to get permission to post it on my website, and if I do get that permission, I'll mention it in an upcoming podcast. But I've attempted to make contact with his family since Dr. Beiser passed away a few years ago, and so I was really hoping to maybe try to get permission to post this just as kind of a marker of software testing history in our profession and all of that. So I'll keep you apprised of how that went. And some of you know my story about me getting his book, Software Testing Techniques, the first edition, in the mail because I did not return my Book of the Month Club selection card. And I was a developer at the time, and I thought, why do I need a book on testing? I'm a developer. But it was a very technical book. I really got a lot out of it. And since then, I've thought about how much work it took to create that book. I mean, today we have word processors and all that. Back at that time, possibly could have used maybe a PC, but probably written with a typewriter. And it has all kind of diagrams in there. It was not an easy effort to write a book back then. And this was not a little book either. Anyway, the thing about it is, it got going through all this material got me thinking about what's happened. What has happened in terms of quality over all these years. There was a huge quality movement that took place worldwide in the 1980s and into the 1990s. And then the internet came along and we all just lost our minds. It was like everything was forgotten. And, when I looked at this notebook that I just held up there, there's a lot of stuff in there, a lot of good stuff about quality management, about risk, about measurement, process improvement, software testing techniques. And I remember the vendor expo around that time at the show. Everything was mainframe based, okay? All the test tools, the few of them that we had, everything was just so rudimentary. We didn't have any of the tools, of course, that we have today. Of course, no cloud platforms, and obviously no AI or anything like that. But at the time we understood something, I think, that was really important, and that is that quality is an organizational issue, is not merely a testing activity. And so as I'm looking through this, and I'm going through some other materials as well, I found an old presentation book from 1999, I think, and I was talking on Y2K testing and that kind of thing. In fact, I have a Hong Kong book from then talking about Y2K. But, when I look at all that, I just think, wow, how much have we forgotten in terms of that? And even, if you go back before that time, even in the 1970s, there was a book. It was required reading for me in college. And you might be familiar with this book called Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. I think the author's name was Persig that wrote that. It's quite a big novel, but it was also this metaphor for quality. And it's an entertaining read, but it's also a very philosophical read. And the whole story is around this guy that he was totally frustrated by the quality of things or lack of quality in things that he would be using and his motorcycle and all of that. So I do recommend reading it, but once again, it's kind of a long read. Coinciding with all of this, just a few days ago, I watched the documentary that's out right now on Netflix about the Boeing company. The name of the documentary is called Freefall, and I guess it's kind of a sequel to another documentary that is out there called Downfall, which goes into the whole Boeing 737 MAX crashes and what led up to those and what they found about those. I can also recommend that, but Freefall was really troubling to me, and I'm not going to give away anything here about the story, but there were just a lot of things in that story that should not have happened. And people died as a result of some of those things. And so it's really serious. And led me to question, how many of these lessons have we really forgotten that some of the earlier quality leaders fought really hard to establish. So this is one of those times where I could tell you I was there. I was there in that quality movement. It was called Total Quality Management, TQM, and it was quite a thing. Everyone was interested, it seemed, in improving quality. Now, whether we actually did it or not, that was another thing, but it was really an important thing. That was kind of when the capability maturity model was developed, and a lot of the things we've kind of seen as derivatives of those things are around. Some of the big ideas I'll just mention here quickly is that quality is created in a systematic way. You don't test it or inspect it into the product afterwards. You've probably heard it said that you can't test quality into software. That was one of the ethics back then. Also, that most quality problems originate in management decisions and organizational processes, as opposed to what individuals might do. And there was also this ethic that you would see in some companies where if anyone noticed a defect in something, manufacturing or whatever, that they had the ability to stop the process and fix the defect, but also fix what was causing the defect. That was the time when Harley Davidson was going through a lot of their quality problems. Now, if you're not familiar with that period of history of Harley Davidson, you probably think of their great motorcycles today and their really fantastic history of motorcycles. But there was a time when they almost lost the company over poor quality. Motorcycles were dripping oil on the showroom floors and all that. And it wasn't until they instituted a practice where the line workers could actually pull this rope, stop the assembly line, and fix the problem that they started to see things improve. Another thing that was a big thing was to drive out fear. That was one of Deming's 14 points. Dr. Deming, he was a statistician, but he was considered one of the big management gurus of the time, and he worked with companies in Japan to improve their manufacturing. And of course, then he came back here to the U.S., and that found a home here too. But I mean, the results were, you can't even debate the results that came out of what he did in Japan. It revolutionized their industrial process, and they started competing in a very big way with U.S. manufacturers. U.S. manufacturers couldn't even compete in the 80s. A typical car engine would last here about 50,000 miles made in the U.S. as compared to a Japanese maker like Toyota, who would be more like 200,000 miles on an engine. But anyway, one of Dr. Deming's 14 points was to drive out fear. And the idea here is that people have to be able to report issues and problems without a fear of retaliation. Another idea there was that instead of reacting to every little defect or number, management, they need to understand the nature of variation, and that it's really the common causes you're after. And this all stems from a thing known as statistical process control, which was a big part of the quality movement back then. And also there was this thing about how if you look at quality, you can't sacrifice quality in the long term for financial results in the short term. It just doesn't pay. You're going to incur cost in the longer term there that are just that they just outweigh anything that you would gain in the short term. There's also the idea that people who are closest to where the work is being performed, they see things before management does. They see the defects, they see the danger, they see the risk before management does. And so we had these big names at the time, Dr. Deming that I mentioned, Dr. Duran Philip Crosby. I think maybe Philip Crosby's book was one of the first ones that I ever read. Those guys were really foundational in the quality movement. I would suggest very few people even would recognize those names today. Today we think about quality as passing all the automation tests, meeting our sprint commitments, increasing deployment frequency. Velocity is a big thing. Closing out defects quickly as opposed to really figuring out what's going on. Coming up with all these flashy dashboards and stuff, and declaring success because no one's seen a severe incident yet. And, none of those things I just mentioned are inherently bad, but they're not a substitute for a quality culture. And I guess my main point in all of this is that we've gained so much in terms of technical capabilities over the last 30 years or so, but I think we've lost some of our organizational understanding of quality. And, this isn't an anti-agile or anti-DevOps rant or anything like that, or even an anti-automation argument. It's just that our modern methods can't overcome what you might think of as an unhealthy management system. And I'll just throw this in, food for thought. Just an observation that a lot of the companies I see that they say they're doing agile, they're really not. They do some kind of weird hybrid thing. They just don't have the cultural component that was originally envisioned for agile. Just because you have user stories in a Jira board doesn't make you agile. And just because you have a stand-up meeting doesn't make you agile either. One of the things I noticed, going back to the Free Fall movie for just a minute, the big problem there wasn't whether or not people could find defects. They were all over the place. The problem was that anytime someone in the company would report a problem, management didn't want to hear about it. And the people would be retaliated against. And it was just this whole organizational culture of getting things done faster, cutting corners, making more money, and totally shoving the quality picture to one side. And sadly, there were two CEOs during these periods of time that neither were held to account. They all went on to their massive salaries and retirement plans and all that, and neither was anyone else in the company. At one time, the DOJ, they had a case, but they did a plea deal with Boeing, and there was never any accountability. I kind of think of this story that one of my friends tells. I wasn't at the conference where this happened, but she was giving a conference presentation, and just to kind of make a point, she asked this crowd of about, maybe 300 or 400 people or more. It might have been at one of the Eurostar conferences, maybe, that if their company had created the software for the airplane that they were getting ready to board, would they still get on board the plane? And no one's hands went up but one guy. One guy raised his hand, so she goes, "Really? Tell me about that." The guy stood up and said, "If my company made the software that flew that plane, I have no worries whatsoever, because the engines wouldn't even start." Now, I don't want to make light of tragic situations, but that's kind of, unfortunately, the mindset right now of some people in quality. And by the way, that story happened a long time ago. But going back, the quality pioneers, they taught us some really key things: drive out fear, break down the silos and the barriers between departments, get rid of all the slogans and buttons and balloons and all that are mainly just cheerleading without actually improving the system. One of the big ones for us testers is to cease dependency on inspections to achieve quality, especially back-end inspections. One of the big things that Dr. Deming brought to the picture of manufacturing was this idea of in-process inspections, where at every step in building something, you're reviewing, you're inspecting, you're testing. It's where you wait until the end. And this was something he taught way back in the 1950s in Japan. So one of the things about the drive out fear, why it's such a big concept and such an important point, is that whenever people fear retaliation, they shut down. They quit raising issues, defects abound, and then you have failures that impact the public. And I think we've kind of lost also the idea that failures impact people in some big ways. Sometimes people die due to failures. Sometimes they're an inconvenience, that kind of thing, but we kind of forget the impact. Now, something else to think about here is that, we have window dressing. My friend Greg Pascal, he calls it quality veneer. We count tests, we count defects, we measure story points, deployments, velocity, coverage, escape defects, and all that. But they don't mean much if people are not free to challenge assumptions and to also raise defects. It's kind of interesting, too, that some of the things we do now, we kind of think are new, but they've been around for a long, long time. You'll hear things like psychological safety. One of my favorites is shift left. We've been doing shift left for many, many years, going back to the 1980s. It wasn't called shift left. It was just called early inspections and reviews. But I'm glad shift left caught on, don't get me wrong. But it's certainly not new. The idea of blameless retrospectives. I think retrospectives were an advance in our profession. Up until that time, they'd been called postmortems, and they didn't really have a very good reputation. And people did tend to assign blame over things back in the earlier days. The idea of whole team quality. Now, when I was a developer back in the 1980s and even a little bit before then, in the late 70s, we were all sitting in one room. And, we were all working together to achieve a good product. So we were working as a whole team back then. That was not all that unusual, actually. The idea of system thinking. Jerry Weinberg wrote his book on system thinking in 1988. It's a classic. You really need to read it if you haven't. It's a big deal. And of course, continuous improvement. That was one of the guru's big quality issues. Now, a lot of these are really valuable things, but here's the thing. The foundations for those things aren't new. A lot of times we're rediscovering the truths of the quality movement decades ago. But here's really, I think, the big question that leaders especially have to confront when it comes to quality, and that is what happens in your organization when someone presents credible evidence that threatens an important deadline, perhaps a budget, product commitment, executive decision, like a release date or something like that. To me, that's the biggest test of all. It's the integrity test. And I think the reaction that you get from raising those kind of things reveals far more about quality and your culture, more than any mission statement ever could. So today, I'm just asking, have we forgotten some of these essential lessons about quality? Now, in a future episode, I'm going to kind of do a little bit deeper dive here on this notebook that I held up. And I'm going to examine what current industry data tells us about the results. My big question is, have we really improved at all in any ways over the last 30 or so years? I really want to know that. I would love to hear your comments about this in the comments. I know a lot of the people that I have worked with over the years. They're now retired. They're no longer in the field. But especially for those of you who have been in the field, let's say since the year 2000 or something like that, I would love to hear your perspective on all of this. So I appreciate you watching this podcast. I hope you subscribe if you found the information helpful. I also hope that you share this with some people if you think that they could profit from this kind of information. So thanks again for watching, and I will see you in the next episode.